talk a lot, again, this program, this Friday show, of course, was inspired by the crisis and the shutdown, but something that I think is, underpinning all of these conversations is that we have done this work for a long time because this work is necessary. And it's not simply about rebuilding and getting back to where we were a year ago. It's about how do we reimagine and how do we build better structures and more equitable, just, and resilient music scenes. And so, Meara and Lori, I'm thrilled to have you. Why don't you say hi real quick? And why don't we just start? And if you could, Meara or Lori, whoever wants to take it first, just tell us a little bit about MusicPortland and tell us what you guys are up to.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Meara McLaughlin. I've talked with a lot of you, and I'm so sorry to not spend another Halloween week in DC with the crew. I'm executive director and one of the founders of MusicPortland. And Lori, why don't you introduce yourself while we're top of
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Hughes-Killen, board president for MusicPortland. Thank you, Michael, for inviting us today to talk with you all.
Of course.
Absolutely.
So I want to say at the outset, again, as I said at the beginning, this is another in a continuing series of city showcases that we've been doing that are really meant to not just kind of check in on what you're immediately doing, although we're going to talk about that in the next 30 minutes, but really thinking bigger and broader about your music ecosystem, about your scene, about your organization, about sort of the vision of what you're trying to accomplish. And I do want to mention at the outset, unfortunately, your colleague, DJ Ambush, is not able to join us today. He is under the weather and sends his regrets. And I'm particularly sad. Ambush was with us last year at our DC conference, and know that he's just got a lot of things that he's just rock and rolling on. So we'll bring him to the show in a future week. And I know you can speak a little bit about some of the things that he's doing. But so why don't we start again, Meara, let's start, or Lori, who wants to take this big picture. Let's just pretend we're having this conversation 9 months ago. We don't know about a pandemic around, coming down the board. What's MusicPortland's role? What are you doing? Why do you exist? And how did you all kind of get moving in the community?
Right. So MusicPortland was founded. It actually began had its official launch in September of 2018. So we're still fairly young, about 2 years old, active. And when we first were founded, Portland has this enormous ecosystem. I mean, it's acknowledged externally. It's a huge part of people's lives here, but it had never been formalized or acknowledged or consolidated. There was no solidarity, no kind of sense of itself as an industry. And watching from the corporate employment side of the house, I was like, oh my God, we're losing things in this growing city. So really formed it with allies like Lori and a lot of other amazing leaders in the community, to really say, how do we look at this from an infrastructure perspective? And our mission at the launch is unite, defend, and amplify the entire ecosystem of our Portland ecology, which is incredibly dense. And what I think people often think is, there's music, and they see the live performers and they think about them and they see the venues, but thinking about all of the industry that goes behind that, all the obviously sound engineers and lighting designers and producers and record labels and distribution companies, of which we have some very large ones, and replication houses and music lawyers. And I don't know, Alex, I sent you an image that we created. Actually, I had looked for this for a long time, trying to find somebody else that had come up with it. And in the process of fighting for venues, we actually created this with the venues kind of central as a primary financial input into an ecosystem. Every city has some version of this. And I have been, with this has left the bubble. If anybody would like this, please let me know. I'm happy to share this document, because it really does help when you're talking to policymakers and people outside the music ecology to understand it's this incredibly complicated, interconnected system. And that if you let venues close, musicians don't make money. They don't hire producers. They don't buy gear. They don't, so everything in this, you can tell the story in a variety of ways. You can say without musicians, this whole thing falls apart. And it does. Without venues, this whole thing falls apart. And it does. So I think that is the nature of what MusicPortland originally said. This is what we want to bring together to build collective power, to make sure that this group understands that we are many and mighty in Portland, that the reputation that we've garnered organically has power to it. And I think people were feeling pretty beleaguered in a growing city that didn't really seem to take them to account. And we certainly hadn't shared in any of the prosperity. One of the things that has definitely come to mind with this is that unite, defend, and amplify as founding principles. We've really spent a lot of time during our national and local racial reckoning that defend is maybe not the right word. In the same way that the REVS process is sort of, I think I've seen a shift, which I love, of from reopen to reimagine. I think that's an incredibly potent redefinition of what the mission is, because we can't just go back to what it was. None of us will. So defend felt a little status quo. So we're still trying to find a word. If anybody out there comes up with a great word to define where I think we all are in terms of our mission as we're defending our respective ecosystems, how do we make sure that we're talking about optimizing, and reimagine? I could just steal reimagining. That sounds wild. Let's use that. But so anyway, that we started with that. We also started thinking that we weren't going to be cannibalizing any of the existing traditional arts funding mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
Saw
Mm-hmm.
commercial popular music as something different. And I think that in the face of COVID, that's had to really flip on its ear. And I'll be talking more about that in terms of strategy, but the idea originally was to say we're going to fund our efforts, our advocacy efforts as a C6 through industry memberships, but understanding that pitching an industry or trade association to a group of people who don't even recognize themselves as an industry has been quite challenging. So it's been about sort of educating folks on what solidarity and industry advocacy is at a remedial level. We also assumed that because we confirmed that stakeholders in the larger business community rely on our music ecology for their own success, we were planning in 2020 to actually tap those for resources as well. That all went out the window in, as you say, year of our Lord 2020, where all bets are off. But our goal was to really defend the entire ecosystem, to look at it holistically, and to explore and resolve challenges that impacted everyone. We actually were very specifically not necessarily diving immediately into musicians aren't paid enough by venues, because that's a dividing challenge that I think is more influenced by shared external challenges, the environment of taxes and the way that advances, all the things that make the businesses what they are. Those can get resolved in a collaborative and mutually beneficial way before you go in and say, you venue are the bad guy, you artists are the bad guy. And I think as a sort of immature market, we were tipping into that, and that wasn't productive. So, I'll stop there. That is kind of who we are.
That's so interesting. And I've got this is going to be possibly a very poorly worded question / reflection, but I mean, I think part of what, I don't have, as deep a relationship with Portland as I wish. I mean, I've spent time there. I've got a lot of friends there. I love visiting there, but I don't feel like I have any standing. But it feels to me as an outsider that there are two dynamics that I would love for you and Lori to kind of reflect on. And it gets to, again, the whole kind of Music Cities movement, the whole conversation. And again, some communities are engaged in music cities or this kind of creative economy, infrastructure building work from a very tactical level, right? I mean, they're trying to build their resources. They're trying to make things happen. They're trying to, kind of become more attractive. But I think more typically to what we see, and again, I'm thinking about in the Portland context, I'm thinking about New Orleans, I'm thinking about Denver, I'm thinking about DC, that there are these twin challenges. That one is this big, broad, almost existential question about, are we passive in sort of just accepting the structures of what's happening in our community and in our cultural scene, or do we have agency to engage in that? Which I know many people in Portland have been working to kind of organize and figure out what does it look like to assert agency. The other is, a phrase that we use internally, and I'm not sure if it's the right phrase, it probably is totally not the right phrase, but certainly comes out of a lot of our colleague Ashley Keaton's thinking in New Orleans around the concept of cultural continuity, around the understanding of what is it about our community and our culture, our organic indigenous cultural scene that is important to us, that is going to be altered by the sort of economic development of our city and the changing nature of our city, that we want to understand and be able to say, we don't want to put it in a museum, but we want to understand what is the base that we're going off of. And we see that certainly, again, I would not die on the hill that cultural continuity is the right phrase for that, but certainly that's been the undertone of a lot of the Washington, D.C. activism around go-go, you know, and I know that Portland, I mean, I'd love to hear your take just in terms of like, what would you say, like when you think about Portland as a music community, what are the sort of underlying, like what's the scene like? Like what are the genres that are popping? Like what are the things that we may or may not know about as people who haven't spent a lot of time there?
Well, Portland, I think, is definitely recognized as an indie city, you know, to the degree that's a genre or a kind of way of being. But I've also had people say, oh, yeah, Portland, that's a banjo town, right? Which is hilarious. Full disclosure, I do play banjo. But I think that what we have here, you know, where you've got New Orleans that has sort of an anchor genre, you've got Austin that's got an anchor genre, Nashville has an anchor, not that they don't have lots of other things, but they definitely have an identity. For us, having indie be our, if anything, anchor genre, it transcends actual musical genre. And I think that what Portland is most known for is sort of genre busting or genre bending, or people are trying to do things that are really different and new. We also have a very vibrant hip hop culture that has been, you know, very much at the center of a lot of our protest movements. You know, many of the leaders of the most visible leaders of the protest movement are themselves musicians, music writers, music advocates. Because I think that the hip hop community has really been at the forefront of a lot of the things that have been happening. So for those that don't know Portland, I think you're going to find variety. I think we've got an incredibly high level of talent here amongst our local musicians, and it's across the board. It's in, you know, just about every single genre. And Lori, you've been booking for years and celebrating our national folks. What do you say to this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the variety that we see here is pretty wide. But I think it's interesting. I think like the racial inequities really tie in a lot with how our scene gets viewed in terms of the way it skews. Because hip hop has been, we're not known nationally in larger, like other communities as being like a dense hip hop rich scene, but it's been in and out for the last 20 years. Like it goes in waves where like the Portland hip hop, the organic Portland hip hop is like, that's the moment, that's the thing. And then I think a lot of the systemic issues that we face, like looking specifically at hip hop, kind of suppress it back down. So when you're having issues with, you know, the police specifically targeting venues or hosting hip hop events, and then venues become afraid or sort of timid around whether or not they should even, you know, book that genre more often, then it kind of like pushes it back down and it goes underground. And there's always like these really amazing things coming out of certain neighborhoods, like the St. John's neighborhood, for example. A lot of the hip hop has been coming out of that specific area of town for the last, you know, 3 years or so, but there's not like a dedicated performance space over there for the artists to be able to showcase. So it's things like that there's a lot going on here that you wouldn't know because it's not being featured like out there for everyone to see. You know, we also have a really rich Latinx community here. We've got a lot of young people that are producing some really cool stuff, and it's just I feel like we're just barely dipping our toe into what is here. So I think access and visibility is an issue for our scene. for me, what I think is going to be really interesting coming out of 2020 is how much it's sort of like lifted, like drawn the curtains back for everybody to see what is here, because we have to get more engaged, and we're hearing from each other more and learning about each other more. So yeah, that doesn't really answer the question of like what to say what we are, because we don't have a defined scene, but we're very rich. There's more diversity here than I think people really realize.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's also electronic music. It's huge. We're the modular synth epicenter of the world, says Reverb magazine. There's a huge, I know, look at that. I'm going to make a t-shirt. We've got amazing neo soul artists that are kind of coming to the front. We've got rhythm and blues. We've got, indie rock and singer-songwriters. It is not on any kind of limit, which has been really fun to bring to light. Looking again as MusicPortland at the external limitations that are placed on our city, manifesting all of its excellence. And that's things like, insurance redlining, and that is something I would love to see this collective take on and start to document across cities and really take on. I know with our congressional, with our senators, they say, great, bring it to us. Tell us what needs to happen. This is a horrific systemic impediment that everybody is suffering. So I'd love to see MPF or MCT come together and work on that. I don't know. That was a rambly way to answer your question.
No. That's fantastic. And again, this is a little bit of an outsider perspective, but and I'm sure that y'all get sick of this sort of quasi-romanticized notion of Portlandia and this sort of progressive oasis that's also kind of a little bit silly and a little bit whatever you'd want to say. But I do know. I think the combination of quality of life, of perceived affordability, I don't know if it's true affordability, but perceived affordability, the ecosystem that you documented is so incredibly powerful that it certainly in terms of my networks and people I work with and people I'm friends with, I mean, it's really been, important for them to have Portland as a hub. And I know, one city, which I will not name, we were doing some conversations with trying to help them sort of understand their ecosystem and support it. And the question is, well, who do you think of like your local bands? Like, who are the bands that people would recognize? And they mentioned a band, and it's like, well, yeah, but that band had one hit and moved to Portland, so that doesn't count. But anyway, it's it's fascinating. And so I want to pivot again to some of the more incremental kind or more direct 2020 stuff. And you touched on a bunch of it, but I'd like to, there's sort of three different pieces I think that are really helpful for our audience today. And let me lay them out, and then you can take them in whatever order would be best for you. So one is certainly, Portland, for very complicated reasons, some of which, well, anyway, I don't need to unpack them, but you've obviously been in the center of the maelstrom in terms of social justice conversations and street protests. And again, we're sorry that Ambush is not able to join us today, but I know that there's been, in many cities that we've been having conversations with and that are part of the REVS project, it's been really exciting to see the interconnection of, again, the cultural economy issues and conversations and the speech issues and the musical identity issues and where that fits in social justice movements. And I know that this is something that's been a big part of where your focus has been this year and will be continuing. So I'm going to ask you to, well, let me just start there. And again, I know you can't speak for Ambush and some of the stuff he's leading, others are working on, but maybe just give a quick sense of what that, what you'd like audiences here to know about, in terms of what tangibly is happening around that intersection right now in Portland.
Yeah. Well, I will say, don't believe the hyperbole. Portland, there are, the terrorism that is supposedly happening are small bonfires and graffiti. And the fact that people are being hospitalized in response to that kind of public action is, hopefully people see through the rhetoric. The reality is, tragically, that all of this protest here locally, it's a budget issue. Mm-hmm. it is about a police department that, you know, there are documented ways that is absolutely irrefutable that they have disadvantaged and acted unfairly to our Black community. So having music people at the center of it has been really remarkable. Ambush's radio station, which is called The Numberz, that refers to the outer limits of Portland, where most of our people of color being displaced by gentrification have moved to and have created a new, some new sense of community out there, but there's still diaspora. The Numberz has some amazing agents on it who have been talking and giving voice and witness to this action as it evolves and constantly sort of playing it back. And I know, you know, for me as a nice white lady in Portland, it has been remarkably eye-opening to have that kind of media outlet, having those candid conversations in public. Because I think part of what Portland has suffered forever, since it was founded as a white utopia, is that these conversations are happening without us, and that having two parallel conversations is not a benefit for anybody. Our music ecology, looking at it, and, you know, Lori and I came into this with all best intentions, but it's really this moment and this year and these protests that have caused us both to really go back and look and say, how are we part of it? You know, we're a product of the city that we live in. We're a product of that siloed and isolated conversation, and have been doing a ton of work to build engagement and make sure that we're listening to BIPOC leadership and that we're getting that information in to help derive the kind of work that we're doing. One thing that we, you know, it's a perfect Portland example. Portland, everybody will say, you come to Portland, it's amazing. You go to a bar, you're talking to some guy, it's great. Then you find your producer, the producer of your dream that makes you, you know, it's like, oh my, I started as a bartender and because I was a band, and then I became a production manager, now I'm a booker. We're a town that clings desperately to its sense of itself as a small little friendly town. We're not a small little friendly town. And the idea that we still, you know, slap on the back who you know is racist as hell. It's completely exclusionary. So that Music Portland, looking at this and saying, that ain't gonna work. We're creating a full industry directory for the first time in Portland history, and making sure that you can filter based on values and attributes to be able to say, I'm looking for Black-owned studios. Wait a minute, there's 120 of them listed. There's one that's Black, that's a problem. As you can bring this information and access out there, I think all of it's going to help inform what we as Portlanders like to enjoy in our comfortable, friendly, small town bubble. And it's been hurting people. And so we as an ecology need to do better than the city that we're in and acknowledge the places where white bias are really excluding people that shouldn't be excluded.
Yeah. So continuing on some of the 2020 themes, we're thrilled that you all have been a REVS pilot. Again, everybody who's watching the program, I'm sure at this point is familiar with the Reopen Every Venue Safely initiative that we launched this year. That includes 11 pilot cities in the United States, and Portland has been one of them. The design of the cohort very intentionally was not prescriptive. It was bottom up and is meant to sort of help catalyze collaboration across cities and local organizing. And you all have done a bunch of stuff that has just been really exciting and stuff that other cities have learned from and are kind of picking up on. And I don't know, Lori, you've been leading a lot of the REVS work. If you could, you know, kind of speak to some of the stuff that you've been doing in terms of, you know, particularly in terms of trying to do stakeholder engagement and really trying to understand where the community is. So maybe you could start with just a brief sort of perspective on Portland and REVS and like what the reopening conversation even is, you know, from a macro level, and then go into some of the tactics that you guys have employed that have been really fun to watch.
Sure, absolutely. So it's been an interesting process for us because most of us here our restrictions are so restrictive that talking about reopening, it's pretty ambiguous because, you know, no matter what, so we have three phases here, which basically go from the numbers. You can have 50 people indoors in phase one, 100 people indoors in phase two, no matter what square footage you have for your building, to phase three, there's a vaccine and everybody's cured and you can go back to normal. So it's been challenging to really try to think about a reopening process. And then you couple that with needing to address the funding issue right away, knowing that, the restrictions were just so tight that we had to address the funding right away. So we had to work in tandem with that process. And so we had to pause things for a bit and just kind of wait and see how that funding effort played out. So once that got taken care of and kind of settled, by mid-September, venues were ready to start engaging. And so we're able to put together a work group. And for the last 6 weeks, we've been doing a lot of knowledge sharing. That group, we've got about 18 venues, different venues, and a couple, so most of them are from Portland, but we did pull in a few from other areas of the state because we do have some venues that are in a phase two situation that they actually have been able to do a few socially distanced things this summer. So we really wanted to understand what that looked like since we all share the same restrictions statewide. So we wanted to get their intel to see how things were going and try to get some feedback from their patrons that were able to participate. So at this point, where we're at, we've been able, because we can't really draft like a really, executable opening plan at this point. What we've been doing is just gathering all of the best practices, gathering the resources. We have gotten a couple of surveys that we've been able to get out, which have been great because it gives us a lot of information about, okay, should we, how far do we go in this conversation? What are our patrons telling us? What are our musicians telling us? So we started with the musicians in the summer. I think it was in mid to late July, because there were a lot of bars and restaurants and venues that were doing some outdoor situations. So we wanted to kind of get ahead of it and start thinking about the fall as things move indoors. And we didn't get a ton of engagement there. We think we had around 250 or so participants, and some folks from Seattle and a few folks from Ohio also jumped in. But 75% of the musicians that did engage still feel very, very itchy about going indoors to play. So that was a really telling information. And then the current survey that we're running is an audience engagement survey, which as of this morning, we're over 10,000 participants, and we're running it through Sunday. And so we've got a lot of great takeaways to look at there. Ventilation seems to be one of the key issues that folks are talking about. Everyone, like by and large, I would say 80% to 90% of the folks have said they really, really miss coming to live music. And then we've got a few more questions in there asking, which ways do folks feel comfortable participating, in a socially distanced indoor space, socially distanced outdoor space? Do you prefer it to be a general admission situation? Do you want it to be a potted reserved seating situation? So we've got a lot of data points there. And then also have a lot of comments. We've got over 3,000 general feedback comments about various things, from how are they feeling in general about the idea of opening to other things they'd like to see that we didn't ask in the survey. So that's going to be really, really great for us to be able to share back to our venues, so that if folks do want to start thinking about reopening, they understand what their patrons are looking for, what they expect. And for us as an industry, it's given us like a wonderful opportunity to just take ownership over the reopening process for ourselves and make sure that we're, hopefully we'd like to be able to demonstrate to the state that we're an ally in the process, and that we want to be actively involved. And this is the way that we're taking ownership over that. We want to take care of our fans. We want to take care of our staff. We want to make sure the artists are taken care of too. It's not just, hey, we want to get back to business. We want to do it as safely as possible. So far, it's been a really great process to be involved in, just because venues don't talk to each other traditionally. I'm sure that's come up a lot in other conversations on the show that you've had. So that's been really interesting because we have to do it together. We can't stay Portland. I think Meara kind of really illustrated this off the top. We've been very siloed in our little sections, talk about podding. So it's kind of interesting that like we're talking about podding our patrons when we've all been podded all along. And now we're having to come together in all of these different ways to talk about the issues at hand and get creative and communicate. Communication is just key. So, so that's kind of the big picture, what we've done here with that process.
No, that's awesome. And just to kind of amplify and build on a couple of points you made. I mean, I think one of the, when we launched the REVS initiative, nobody knew anything about what we're doing, right? I mean, we knew that there are fundamental basics that we had to respond to as a community, including the fact that we were going to have structural shutdown of live music, that at some point we would have to reopen, that nobody really knew what that looked like in terms of timing or in terms of protocols. But what, we kind of placed a big bet on as a national leadership team was this notion of community and this notion that, in many music scenes, it's not sort of a traditional kind of business to consumer dynamic. It really is like, this is us coming together. And, the people that you see in the front row of the shows are often the people who are playing down the street on Thursday night, or the people that are working at the bar. It is a community effort. And very organically, Portland was one of many of our REV cities that immediately on their own gravitated towards this notion of, almost sublimating the sort of economic crisis element to this, because obviously this is an existential economic crisis for everybody in the music industry. But deprioritizing that in favor of the health of our venue employees and the health of our musicians. And if we didn't have the health stuff figured out, we were not going to be able to push, or we didn't want to push, that reopening conversation. And then the corollary to that with the audience research is so powerful. Because again, and I'm not trying to be binary and like throw other industries or businesses under the bus, but we see, right now we're back in July numbers, right? We're back in July numbers in large part because a lot of businesses don't care. And they are just flaunting all the public health advice. And we're going to reap what that sows. And in the music side, I don't mean to diminish the public health aspect and the tragedy of all the illness and the death and everything else. On, the music community side, there's a real, again, sort of dichotomy or contradiction between, how a lot of communities and venues are trying to do this in one way and how people are doing a different way. And the fact that, I don't know what I'm talking about, obviously, but I feel very strongly philosophically that the fact that, cities like Portland are doing the direct outreach to the community to say, what do you need to see from us? And what can we ask of you? And that when we get to the point when it's time to reopen, when the science allows us to reopen, you have a dialogue established that's going to be so powerful and so much more impactful than other just random businesses that are just like, don't care or not engaged in the conversation. So the fact that you've got over 10,000 audience participants in the survey, in a short amount of time without a lot of infrastructure behind it, is really exciting. I know a lot of the other REV cities are watching and are eager to kind of learn what they can from what you're doing on that. So that's just super exciting. We're close to time, but I do want to pin back to one other issue, which again was referenced in today's conversation, but I just want to bring to the forefront. Part of what has been so impressive about the work done in Portland through all your partners, and again, I know you'd be the first to say this is not the Meara and Lori show. I mean, this is a community-wide effort, but the ability to sort of take the ecosystem documentation and understanding to be able to then take that into the political conversation and political system to get the local and state resources that have been helpful in keeping things even, having the potential to move forward. And, so Kate Becker talked earlier about King County and Seattle and what's happening there with some public funding and some philanthropic efforts. Could you speak briefly, maybe Mary, you want to take this one, just about what you've been doing in terms of tagging on to state activism and organizing to get some relief dollars and some significant investment?
Yeah, absolutely. So out of the ashes of COVID and the closure of the venues sprang the Independent Venue Coalition, which has been spearheaded by pretty much one incredibly intrepid guy, Jim Brunberg, here in town. And he really brought an incredible sort of groundswell around the one issue. And as I watched, I was a little like, oh God, wouldn't it be cool to have one issue? But he really focused the work, and he got all of the venues across the state. He was really looking at dedicated venues, at those venues that could not reopen at all without music, and music at a scale. So he was able to do that, fought incredibly hard at the state level to get, I believe at the time, if not still, the largest allocation by a state to support our performance venues. And he did that by, bringing together nonprofits and for-profits and theater venues and music venues. And it really created a life support for those dedicated venues. Meanwhile, kind of in a divide and conquer approach, I focused the MusicPortland efforts on the city advocacy to find the CARES money that the city had received, and make sure that our performance venues, again, nonprofit, for-profit, music, theater, dance, were acknowledged in that. And we got the largest city. We got 2.5 million, which is more than Austin, more than Nashville, to support our venues. And that is really very much about having a cohesive story and making sure that your story, as you say, is informed by the musician's story, by the fan's story, and that you're talking about, I'm totally digging the cultural continuity thing, and I definitely want to talk to you more about that, because we've also had these conversations. Keep Portland weird is something we all just cringe at. Portlandia is something we cringe at, because what they both mock is Portland's sense of fearlessness creatively. And that applies to music businesses as well as music creation. And being able to take that forward and actually building coalitions with those places that are representing traditional arts. We've done candidate forums where I brought together the film organization and the arts and culture funding group, our regional arts council, and design week, and all stood together. I wish I had this term then. Stood together to talk to the candidates and say, we're all culture, but in Portland, arts and culture funding are exclusively committed to nonprofit traditional arts approaches. And that's not going to sustain Portland. We have to stand together as culture, get rid of Keep Portland Weird, and come up with a new cultural and creative ethos for the city, because it drives our city. It is our identity. Music is one of the most obvious manifestations of it, but it's in everything that we do. We have more early stage startups that get bought up and taken to California, but we are inventive here. Music is like a standard bearer for that cultural identity as a city, and our advocacy to be able to do that, to bring that kind of story making and that kind of connectivity, to say, this is about all of us. This isn't just about music. This is about us as a city. That has absolutely helped in the funding process. And the last thing I'll say on funding is that we're also finding with the grant processes, it being Portland, there's all kinds of embedded white bias. All of the grants at this point, from CARES money being channeled to the community, to arts grant, to business grants, they all say this is specifically for the BIPOC community. We really want to prioritize BIPOC ownership and BIPOC artists, which is great as a mission. The problem is when you look at the methods and the language of grants and the systems that are doing them, it's just loaded with white bias. If you are saying, we want to support Black artists, and a Black artist comes and says, well, I'm a producer and an MC, and you've got a nice group of well-intentioned white people that go, well, no, we want artists. We don't want people that working in a studio or people, announcing at a fundraiser. We want artists. It's like, it's down to really simple stuff. So that's some of the other stuff we're working with our Black leadership team to make sure that we're actually looking at those things and finding all of the implicit biases that exist, because they are many in our city. But as Lori said, our ability to come together and acknowledge this is a common cultural value in the city and we can do it better. It's an exciting kind of work to be doing.
Yeah. Meara, that's a great way to end up. And Lori, thank you so much both for your work and for joining us today. And And Alex, thanks for producing, Danny for joining, and Kate for joining, and of course, everyone else who participated in today's program. We really appreciate you spending part of your Fridays with us. Again, we're going to be having the archive of this program online Sunday or Monday, and if you thought this was useful and interesting, please feel free to search it out and send it around to your networks. We hope that you all will join us November 19th and 20th for the Music Policy Forum Intensive. Again, you all should be getting emails about that and information in the next couple of days. Next week, we're going to deep dive into Denver. October 30th, we're going to New Orleans. Ashley Heaton has promised costume changes for Halloween. And then the following Friday, November 6th, we're going to do an election debrief and talk about REVS and everything that we've done over the last 6 months. So again, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks for giving us your time and your talent. And we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.